I want to turn to some breaking news that we're just being handed right now from the Washington Post about how the records of the president's phone calls, the transcripts, are being handled. The Washington Post reports the White House has taken extraordinary steps over the past 2 years to block details of President Trump's phone calls with foreign leaders from becoming public following embarrassing disclosures early in his administration that enraged the president and created a sense of paranoia among his top aides. We are joined now by phone by one of the reporters who broke this story, Carol Leonnig, national investigative reporter for the Washington Post. Carol, what else is in your reporting that is relevant now to this whistleblower's complaint?
I think what my good colleague Josh Dawsey and I learned in the course of the last 24 hours, in addition to the details of the whistleblower complaint, which are very logical and methodical, what we learned was that basically the string we've been collecting for a long time, that the president's paranoia about people leaking information about his conversations has been an escalating paranoia. And he has instructed his team to clamp down on who gets to listen into calls and also who can potentially read the readouts from his calls with foreign leaders. That's been going on for a while. But this is new, what the whistleblower alleges, very recent, the idea of transferring what's colloquially called in the intelligence community flipping a routine call transcript into one of the sort of holiest of holy databases for storing information about sources and methods in the intelligence community. The idea of taking a congratulatory call shocked a lot of the people that we interviewed today who have handled these in the past and viewed it as an abuse of that process and just totally extraordinary.
And Carol, how much cooperation have you found in your reporting so far in the White House to what the president wanted? Obviously, there's a certain group that would resist it. They'd want to go by the system that Larry Pfeiffer and others had been using for years. But there had to be some people in the White House who wanted to enable the president's approach to this.
You know, it's a really good big picture question, because one thing I learned today talking to people who used to serve the president and people who are loyal to him still is that they fear he has lost the guardrail people who used to stop him essentially from doing things that were dangerous or incriminating. People like John Kelly, who several sources said to me, John Kelly would have been monitoring this call and would have had an order essentially of managing what was said. There would have been talking points if H.R. McMaster had been involved in this call and encouraging the president to stick to them. There would have been talking points if John Bolton had been a full partner for as a national security national security advisor. John Bolton was kind of on the outs on July 25th when this call took place. A lot of the people that sort of provided guardrails for the president are not here anymore, and that has worried a lot of the president's deepest allies.
Carol Leonnig, thank you very much for joining us with your breaking news reporting tonight. Really appreciate it. And
of course.
Ned Price, Larry Pfeiffer still with us. Larry, let me go straight to you with your reaction to what Carol's revealing tonight in her reporting.
Well, there's always been a fine line in terms of distributing presidential phone call transcripts around government. You want to distribute them far enough that they can be of value to the execution of our national security and foreign policy plans, yet you don't want to distribute them so far that perhaps slightly embarrassing or slightly sensitive material could be getting too broad a dissemination. This White House clearly has made a decision that sharing the conversations of the president with foreign leaders with people who then execute that policy is not a good idea. I think that speaks volumes about what is actually being said in those conversations. And
Ned, Carol used a word that caught me, paranoid, that the president is paranoid about who's listening into the phone calls. It is not paranoid if you are worried about who is listening in to your criminal conspiracies. You should be worried about that. You should be trying to minimize the number of people who do that. The mob bosses who go to great lengths to not have their phones tapped are not paranoid. They know what they're doing, and they know that law enforcement and others have an interest in what they're doing.
Yeah, you know, Lawrence, the president's not wrong about one thing, and that is the transcripts, the contents of his calls have been vulnerable to leaks before. And you always have to ask yourself the question when you see these leak out, what is the motivation behind these leakers? And to be fair, in this White House, you know, it is and always has been, a den of vipers. And there are internecine battles, both in terms of policy and personality. But in so many of the leaks we've seen, including separately with this whistleblower complaint, they're predicated not on this infighting, but on a profound unease, a profound concern with what the president is doing. And in extreme cases like the one we've been discussing over the past week, even the possibility that the president has betrayed his oath of office. And when you think of some of the, shall we say, marquee leaks of this administration, you get that sense. Leaking top secret information to the Russians in the Oval Office, going to meet Vladimir Putin without a note taker, without a translator, and discussing a whole series of issues with him. We could go down the line of leaks that really, I think, illustrate that the people, even those people closest to the president, are profoundly disturbed by what he has done and what he has tried to do.
Ned Price, Larry Pfeiffer, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.